In the silence of his solitary existence, Arthur Schopenhauer uncovered truths about our spiritual nature that most people spend their entire lives avoiding. While known for his pessimism, Schopenhauer's most profound insights weren't about the darkness of existence, but about the hidden spiritual realities that lurk beneath our everyday consciousness. Realities so powerful that sharing them carelessly can lead to profound alienation or even psychological collapse. These aren't mere philosophical concepts, but dangerous truths that, once fully understood, permanently alter how you experience the world. When Schopenhauer retreated from society into his quiet rooms in Frankfurt, accompanied only by his poodles and his thoughts, he wasn't simply avoiding human contact. He was creating the necessary conditions to perceive what most cannot bear to see, the fundamental spiritual mechanisms that govern our existence. What he discovered went far beyond academic philosophy. He mapped the very architecture of human suffering and glimpsed the rare possibilities for authentic liberation. Today, I'll reveal the 5 spiritual secrets Schopenhauer understood that you should guard carefully. Not because knowledge itself is dangerous, but because once internalized, these insights create an unbridgeable gap between you and those who haven't glimpsed these truths. The isolation that follows isn't from physical distance, but from seeing through illusions others desperately need to maintain. People instinctively sense when someone has stepped outside the collective dream, and the reaction is rarely positive. Schopenhauer himself experienced this isolation. After publishing The World as Will and Representation in 1818, his work was largely ignored for decades. Not because it was poorly written or logically flawed, but because it contained truths society wasn't prepared to acknowledge. His insights threatened the comfortable illusions that make ordinary life bearable. This is why these 5 spiritual secrets remain dangerous even today. They expose the machinery behind our most cherished beliefs about ourselves and reality itself. The first spiritual secret Schopenhauer understood is that what you perceive as your individual consciousness is merely a thin veil over something vast and impersonal. We experience ourselves as separate beings with unique identities and personal wills, but Schopenhauer recognized this as a necessary illusion. Behind the illusion of individuality lies what he called the will, a blind, restless, insatiable force that constitutes the inner essence of the entire world. This will isn't your personal desires or ambitions. It's an impersonal, unconscious force that manifests itself through you and everything else in existence. Your sense of having a separate self with independent choices is, according to Schopenhauer, a kind of dream from which most never awaken. When you glimpse the truth, that your consciousness is just a temporary manifestation of something universal and indifferent to your individual concerns, the implications are psychologically devastating. Think about what happens when someone truly internalizes this understanding. They can no longer take their personal desires, ambitions, and fears with the seriousness that others do. They see that what they once thought was their individual will is actually the universal will expressing itself through them. They recognize the same force operating in everyone and everything, in the ambitions of the businessman, the creativity of the artist, the hunger of the wolf, even the relentless growth of plants reaching toward the sun. People instinctively avoid those who have seen through the illusion of individuality. When you stop treating your personal story as supremely important, you become unnerving to others who depend on this mutual pretense. If you've ever met someone who seems strangely detached from their own life circumstances, neither elated by success nor devastated by failure, you've encountered someone who may have glimpsed this first dangerous truth. Schopenhauer observed that we're instinctively uncomfortable around those who don't reinforce our illusion of separate selfhood. We want others to confirm our stories about ourselves, to treat our concerns as significant, to act as if our individual identities are solid and real. When someone no longer participates in this collective game, we sense it immediately, even if we can't articulate what feels off about them. So this first secret, that individual consciousness is a temporary manifestation of an impersonal will, is something you should never carelessly share. Not because it's false, but because truly understanding it changes you in ways that others find disturbing. It creates a fundamental asymmetry in how you and they perceive reality. What they take to be the most basic truth, their separate existence, you now recognize as the primary illusion. The second spiritual secret Schopenhauer discovered is even more unsettling. All desire leads inevitably to suffering, yet desire itself can never be permanently satisfied. This isn't a theoretical concept, but an empirical observation about the structure of human experience. Schopenhauer saw that we exist in a state of perpetual wanting, and our brief moments of satisfaction are merely temporary suspensions of this condition. When you desire something, whether it's wealth, achievement, recognition, or love, you experience a kind of pain from its absence. You imagine that obtaining the object of desire will bring lasting happiness. But Schopenhauer observed a universal pattern. Once a desire is satisfied, the resulting pleasure fades quickly, sometimes in moments, leaving you either bored or already in the grip of a new desire. This isn't a flaw in your psychology. It's the fundamental mechanism of consciousness itself. Consider how this insight affects someone who fully absorbs it. They see the futility in the endless pursuit of satisfaction that drives most human activity. They witness everyone around them locked in a pattern they can never win: desire, brief satisfaction, boredom or new desire, repeat until death. What others experience as the natural rhythm of life, they now recognize as a kind of trap or cosmic joke. Schopenhauer understood that this wheel of desire and suffering isn't something we do, it's something we are. The universal will manifests in us as constant wanting. When we satisfy one desire, the will simply generates another. This is why no achievement, possession, or relationship ever brings lasting peace. The brief satisfaction we feel isn't the natural state finally achieved, but merely a temporary absence of wanting. Imagine trying to explain this to someone caught up in pursuing their next goal, convinced that this promotion, this relationship, this recognition will finally bring them the contentment that has so far eluded them. They don't want to hear that the structure of consciousness itself prevents lasting satisfaction. They need to believe that they just haven't found the right external object yet, that somewhere out there lies the thing that will permanently fulfill them. This is why this second secret should be closely guarded. When you truly understand the relationship between desire and suffering, you stop investing in the pursuits others find meaningful. You might continue to act in the world, but with a fundamental detachment that others find either threatening or depressing. You've stepped outside the motivational structure that gives their lives direction and purpose. What makes this insight especially dangerous is that it can't be unlearned. Once you clearly see the pattern of desire, brief satisfaction, and new desire playing out everywhere, you can't unsee it. Every advertisement, every status update, every new purchase becomes transparent in its mechanics. You recognize in yourself and others the endless reaching for what cannot ultimately satisfy. The third spiritual secret Schopenhauer identified concerns compassion, the only genuine moral virtue, yet one based on an insight most people actively resist. Schopenhauer observed that true compassion arises not from thinking of others as separate beings deserving our charity, but from the direct recognition that the distinction between self and other is ultimately illusory. This isn't the comfortable, self-congratulatory compassion that makes us feel good about ourselves. It's a radical dissolution of boundaries that most find profoundly disturbing. When Schopenhauer speaks of compassion, he means literally suffering with, recognizing that the suffering of another is not fundamentally different from your own, because the consciousness experiencing it is not ultimately separate from yours. The dangerous implication is that genuine morality requires seeing through the illusion of individuality. As long as you perceive others as essentially separate from yourself, your concern for them will always be secondary to your self-interest. Only when you directly perceive the unity behind apparent diversity does authentic compassion arise. But this perception threatens the very foundation of how most people organize their lives and relationships. Schopenhauer understood that true compassion isn't a warm feeling or a charitable action. It's the natural expression of having seen through the illusion of separateness. When the boundaries between self and other thin or temporarily dissolve, you can no longer prioritize your own interests above others because the distinction has lost its fundamental reality. This is why saints and sages throughout history often seem strangely selfless, not because they're forcing themselves to be good, but because they no longer experience the sharp boundary between themselves and others that most take for granted. Consider what happens when someone begins to embody this understanding. Their behavior becomes increasingly inexplicable to those operating from conventional self-interest. Why would they sacrifice their comfort for strangers? Why don't they prioritize their own advancement? The compassion flowing from non-duality doesn't compute in a world built on the assumption of separate selves pursuing separate interests. This is precisely why this third secret should be carefully guarded. When you begin to act from the recognition that self and other are not ultimately separate, you become a walking challenge to how most organize their lives. Your behavior implies that their most basic assumptions about reality may be mistaken. The discomfort this creates often leads to rejection or attempts to explain away your actions in conventional terms, as pathological altruism or disguised self-interest. Schopenhauer himself recognized how rare true compassion is. Most of what passes for moral behavior is actually enlightened self-interest or conformity to social norms. Genuine compassion flowing from the recognition of non-duality is so uncommon that when we encounter it, we often elevate those who embody it to the status of saints or spiritual teachers, simultaneously honoring and distancing ourselves from the implications of their example. The fourth spiritual secret Schopenhauer uncovered reveals why we find true silence so unbearable, yet so necessary for genuine self-knowledge. He observed that most people will go to extraordinary lengths to avoid being alone with themselves in silence. They fill every moment with activity, conversation, entertainment, anything to escape the confrontation with what lies beneath conscious awareness. What Schopenhauer understood, and what makes this insight so dangerous, is that our aversion to silence isn't accidental. It's a deliberate, though usually unconscious, strategy to avoid facing the reality of our condition. In silence and solitude, the illusions that make life bearable begin to dissolve. The stories we tell ourselves about who we are and why we do what we do start to appear increasingly flimsy. This is why Schopenhauer himself embraced solitude despite its difficulties. He recognized that truth requires a willingness to step away from the constant reinforcement of collective illusions. The noise of society, both literal and figurative, drowns out the insights that emerge only in silence. But these insights come at a cost. They increasingly alienate you from conventional social reality. Consider what happens to someone who regularly practices extended silence. They begin to see how much of what we consider thinking is actually just the recycling of received ideas. They notice how many of their desires and fears are not really their own, but implanted from outside. They may even glimpse that the solid sense of self they normally experience is more fragile and constructed than they previously recognized. As these realizations deepen, they find themselves increasingly out of step with a society built on noise and distraction. They can't participate with the same unconsciousness in conversations that now appear to them as exchanges of unexamined assumptions. Their decreased reactivity to social cues makes others uncomfortable. They no longer provide the expected responses that smooth social interactions. This is why the spiritual value of silence should rarely be directly discussed. Those who haven't experienced extended silence can't understand its transformative power, and those who have already know. Attempting to explain it to someone actively avoiding silence will typically result in either blank incomprehension or active resistance. Schopenhauer observed that most people experience their own company as a kind of torture. Left alone with themselves, without distraction, they confront the emptiness and restlessness at the core of their being, what he identified as the endless striving of the will. Rather than face this directly, they flee into any available noise or activity. The person who has learned to sit in silence has developed a capacity that seems almost supernatural in our distraction-addicted world, the ability to be present with what is, without immediately seeking to escape it. This capacity fundamentally changes their relationship to everything, creating a gulf between them and those still running from themselves. The fifth and perhaps most dangerous spiritual secret Schopenhauer identified concerns the true nature of freedom and how fundamentally we misunderstand it. What he discovered was that the conventional notion of freedom, being able to do whatever you want, is not freedom at all but a subtler form of bondage. True freedom, in Schopenhauer's understanding, comes not from fulfilling desires, but from breaking free from the tyranny of the will itself. This insight directly contradicts our culture's core assumption that maximizing choice and fulfilling desires leads to liberation. Schopenhauer saw that this approach actually deepens our enslavement to the will. The more options we have, the more we become dominated by wanting itself. Each choice becomes another expression of the insatiable will rather than a step toward genuine freedom. The dangerous truth is that real freedom comes only through the denial of the will, not through repression or ascetic self-torture, but through seeing through the illusion that fulfilling desires brings lasting satisfaction. This isn't an intellectual understanding, but a lived realization that fundamentally transforms one's relationship to wanting itself. Schopenhauer identified several paths to this freedom: aesthetic contemplation, ethical awareness, and ascetic practice. In each case, what occurs is a temporary or permanent quieting of the will's constant demands. In aesthetic contemplation, for instance, we briefly step outside the perspective of wanting and into pure perception. In ethical awareness, we transcend our individual interests. In ascetic practice, we systematically weaken the will's hold on us. Consider what happens to someone who begins to experience genuine freedom in Schopenhauer's sense. Their behavior becomes increasingly puzzling to others. They may pursue goals, but without the desperate attachment most bring to their desires. They can take or leave outcomes that others find all-important. They experience a kind of equanimity that seems almost inhuman to those still fully identified with their wants and fears. This is precisely why this fifth secret should be closely guarded. When you begin to embody true freedom, freedom from the tyranny of your own desires, you become a walking challenge to the consumer society built entirely on stimulating and temporarily satisfying desire. Your contentment without obvious cause threatens a social order that depends on everyone constantly wanting more. Schopenhauer himself recognized how rare this kind of freedom is. Most of what passes for freedom in our world is actually just the ability to follow desires we didn't choose to have. Genuine freedom, the ability to exist peacefully even when desires aren't satisfied, is so uncommon that when we encounter it, we often misinterpret it as indifference, depression, or some other pathology. Let's pause for a moment. As we've been exploring Schopenhauer's insights into the nature of desire and freedom, I want to ask you something personal. Have you ever achieved something you wanted desperately, only to feel that strange emptiness once you had it? That moment when the promotion, the relationship, the recognition you thought would finally make you complete arrived, and the satisfaction lasted only briefly before you found yourself wanting something else. I know it's difficult to admit, because our entire culture is built on the promise that the next achievement, purchase, or experience will be different. But if you dare, leave me a comment saying, "I recognize that cycle in my life when," and complete it with your experience. You are not alone in this. Your words might be exactly what someone else needs to read today to feel understood. Sometimes naming our suffering is the first step to transforming it, and Schopenhauer gives us the language to do exactly that. Now let's continue with how these spiritual insights transform our understanding of reality. The implications of these 5 spiritual secrets extend far beyond philosophical curiosity. They fundamentally alter how you experience yourself and the world. Once internalized, they create a kind of cognitive dissonance in everyday interactions. You see the machinery operating beneath social exchanges that others experience as natural and inevitable. You recognize the patterns of desire and suffering playing out in individual lives and collective movements. Consider what happens when you fully absorb Schopenhauer's insights. You begin to notice how much of human behavior is driven by the restless striving of the will disguised as personal choice. You see how rare genuine freedom is, and how what passes for freedom is usually just the unconscious following of implanted desires. You recognize that most social interactions involve the mutual reinforcement of illusions necessary for conventional life to continue. This awareness creates a kind of double consciousness. You participate in the social world, but with the constant recognition of the deeper currents flowing beneath it. You use the language of individual choice and personal identity, while seeing through the substantiality of both. You witness suffering and try to alleviate it, while understanding its roots in the very structure of consciousness itself. Schopenhauer himself lived with this double consciousness. He participated in society enough to function within it, but maintained the inner distance necessary to see it clearly. His writings emerged from this unique position, engaged enough to understand conventional experience, detached enough to see its underlying patterns. This is the stance that becomes inevitable once you've absorbed these dangerous truths. What makes these spiritual secrets particularly dangerous in our age is their incompatibility with the stories our culture tells about itself. We live in a time that celebrates desire and its fulfillment as the path to freedom and happiness. Consumer capitalism depends on the belief that satisfaction comes from external acquisition. Social media thrives on the assumption that our individual stories and perspectives are centrally important. Schopenhauer's insights undermine these foundational assumptions. They suggest that the very structure of consciousness itself prevents desire from ever bringing lasting satisfaction. They imply that our sense of separate selfhood is a necessary illusion rather than an ultimate truth. They indicate that real freedom comes not from maximizing choice, but from breaking free from the tyranny of wanting itself. This is why these truths, when fully absorbed, inevitably lead to a kind of alienation. You find yourself living in a society built entirely around principles you now recognize as fundamentally flawed. You witness the suffering created by these misunderstandings, yet find it nearly impossible to communicate the alternative you've glimpsed. The isolation this creates isn't merely intellectual, but deeply existential. You experience a kind of vertigo as social reality reveals itself to be a collective construction rather than a given truth. You notice how tenaciously most defend the very illusions that guarantee their suffering. You recognize the patterns of the will working through individual lives and collective movements with an inevitability that can seem almost mechanistic. Schopenhauer understood this alienation intimately. His philosophy emerged from his direct perception of truths most actively avoid. The price of this clarity was a lifelong sense of being out of step with his contemporaries, seeing what they couldn't or wouldn't see, unable to fully communicate insights that contradicted their most basic assumptions about reality and themselves. This is ultimately why these 5 spiritual secrets should be shared only with great care. Not because knowledge itself is harmful, but because these particular insights, when deeply internalized, permanently alter your relationship to conventional reality. They create a fundamental asymmetry between your perception and that of most others. They make full participation in the collective dream increasingly difficult, yet Schopenhauer did not consider these insights cause for despair. On the contrary, he saw them as the necessary foundation for any authentic liberation. Only by clearly seeing the mechanisms of suffering can we begin to free ourselves from their grip. Only by recognizing the illusory nature of separate selfhood can genuine compassion arise. Only by understanding the relationship between desire and suffering can we find a way beyond both. This is perhaps the final paradox. These dangerous truths, while initially alienating, contain the seeds of a deeper connection to reality and others. The same insights that separate you from conventional understanding potentially unite you with what Schopenhauer considered the ultimate reality, the universal will behind all individual manifestations. The same clarity that makes ordinary social participation more difficult opens the possibility for authentic compassion based on the recognition of fundamental non-duality. Schopenhauer himself found solace in art, ethics, and contemplation, not as escapes from reality, but as windows into its deeper nature. In aesthetic contemplation, he discovered temporary freedom from the tyranny of desire. In ethical awareness, he found the dissolution of boundaries between self and other. In philosophical understanding, he achieved a clarity that, while isolating, provided its own kind of peace. The person who has absorbed these dangerous truths stands at a crossroads. They can no longer fully participate in the collective illusions that make conventional life seamless, yet they've glimpsed possibilities for authentic being that most never consider. They live with a foot in 2 worlds, the conventional reality of separate selves pursuing separate interests, and the deeper reality of universal will expressing itself through temporary forms. This divided consciousness is the inevitable result of seeing what Schopenhauer saw. It creates a kind of exile from ordinary certainties, yet potentially opens access to insights and experiences most never encounter. It constitutes both a burden and a rare opportunity, the burden of clarity in a world committed to illusion, the opportunity to experience liberation that comes only through facing truth directly. So these 5 spiritual secrets, the illusory nature of separate selfhood, the inherent connection between desire and suffering, the basis of true compassion in non-duality, the transformative power of silence, and the paradoxical nature of genuine freedom, remain dangerous precisely because they're true. Not abstractly or theoretically true, but practically true in a way that transforms anyone who fully absorbs them. Schopenhauer himself never suggested that everyone should immediately confront these truths. He recognized that illusions serve important functions in human life and society. He understood that seeing through these illusions comes with real psychological and social costs. His philosophy wasn't a call for universal awakening, but a documentation of what he had personally discovered through careful observation and contemplation. This is ultimately why these insights should be shared carefully, if at all. Not everyone is ready to have the foundations of their reality questioned. Not everyone can bear the initial isolation that comes from seeing differently than those around them. Not everyone is prepared for the responsibilities that come with clarity. The obligation to live authentically from what you've seen, even when doing so, separates you from conventional certainties. Yet for those already sensing the limitations of conventional understanding, already questioning the promises of desire fulfillment, already experiencing the gap between social reality and their deepest intuitions, Schopenhauer's dangerous insights may not be burdens, but confirmations. They may provide language and clarity for what was already vaguely perceived. They may offer not the beginning of alienation, but the end of a more fundamental kind of isolation. The isolation of seeing without having conceptual frameworks to understand what you're seeing. This is the paradoxical gift of Schopenhauer's philosophy. It initially separates you from conventional understanding, but potentially connects you to something deeper. It shatters comfortable illusions, but offers the possibility of authentic liberation. It creates distance from the collective dream, but opens the possibility of genuine compassion based on the recognition of underlying unity. In the end, these dangerous spiritual secrets are dangerous only to illusion. The illusions that keep us trapped in patterns of suffering, the illusions that prevent us from recognizing our deeper nature, the illusions that maintain the boundaries between ourselves and others. They threaten not authentic being, but the obstacles to it. They challenge not truth, but the comfortable lies we tell ourselves to avoid confronting truth directly. If you've recognized yourself in Schopenhauer's insights, if you've felt that endless cycle of desire and disappointment, if you've glimpsed the illusory nature of separate selfhood, if you've experienced the freedom that comes from stepping outside wanting itself, you're not alone on this path. This channel is a refuge for those who seek to understand the deepest truths of our existence, not to drown in pessimism, but to find authentic liberation through clear seeing. I invite you to subscribe, not as another number, but as part of a community of seekers who dare to look beyond the veil of everyday illusions. Every week we explore these philosophical truths together and how to apply them to find peace in a chaotic world. Leave a comment sharing which of Schopenhauer's 5 spiritual secrets resonates most with you. I take time to read each reflection and respond personally. And if you know someone who's also searching for deeper answers, share this video with them. Sometimes the knowledge we need most comes through those who care about us. I'll see you in the next video, where we'll explore how, according to Schopenhauer, art offers us genuine moments of freedom from suffering. Until then, remember, seeing the truth, however isolating it may initially be, is the first step toward living authentically.